Greetings, everyone. I'm sorry that we missed last week. I had so much going on. My car died. It just like and quit working. So now today, um, we are finishing up our last study. Now, I say that next week I may add one more. Actually, looking at a passage in Jude that really is not considered one of the Clobber passages, but is considered something that kind of is taken along the same way, is taken out of context, and um, it a lot of times have been used to provide exclusion and things like that for people, and so anyway, the goal of this series of Bible studies that we've been looking at has actually been inclusion, to find inclusion among the church. And so tonight we are going to look at the last of the Clobber passages. Um, and so as we get started, there's a couple of things I want to do. First and foremost, I want to mention, I want to kind of tie back. This has nothing to do with our Clobber passage for tonight, but I want to tie back to something we talked about during Genesis and Leviticus. And this is also something that's come up every time in the book of Corinthians, in the book of Romans, and it's going to come up tonight in the book of Timothy a little. But something I do want to mention that really has nothing to do with the Clobber part is we had said originally that in the book of Genesis and the book of Leviticus, that was actually passages that were written at a very much later date. So a lot of people try to claim that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were all written by Moses. That's an ancient idea. That's something that the church has tried to say for thousands of years. Okay, and we talked a few weeks ago about how most likely, due to modern scholarship, they have determined that most likely those books in the form that we have them now. Now, not saying that there isn't a form of those books, there wasn't some type of writing, but in the form that we have today, well, in at least in the form that the New Testament would have had, because we know that things still change over the hundreds of years and thousands of years, but in the form that the New Testament would have had, these books were probably not written until the Babylonian Empire. And the Babylonian Empire actually occurred like after the time of David, or the Babylonian captivity, rather, Babylonian exile, did not occur till after the time of David and Solomon and their children. Whenever we find out in the books of Kings and Chronicles that the country of Israel split. And you have the northern 10 tribes and you have the southern 2 tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin. And the northern 10 tribes were taken, it talks about in like Hosea. They ultimately, and it was prophesied by people like Hosea, they were going to be taken and taken ultimately to the Assyrians, and they were gone. Basically, the northern kingdom, where we find the city of Samaria, these parts of Israel basically disappeared. And you hear people talk about the lost people of Israel. Well, that's coming from the northern part of the kingdom, because they disappeared. They were gone. Sometimes people have hypothesized many different things, but the northern kingdom just disappeared. They were taken into Assyria and they assimilated and they never came back. Now, the southern kingdom, which was what we call Judah or Judea, were basically just the two sections, the two groups of Judah and Benjamin. They were taken later into the Babylonian Empire. And when they were taken into the Babylonian Empire, there was a lot of stuff going on. And they ultimately returned in Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah brought them back, or Ezra brought them back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah brought more people back to rebuild the wall. And ultimately, that's when people returned. And then we move on through the Persians, the Greeks. The Babylonians, and we talked about this early on, Babylonian was like Nebuchadnezzar. And then Persians came in, and that's in the time of Daniel. And then ultimately the Greeks. Now there was a section of time where they were free. They had about 100 years where they had their own. And this is basically what we refer to as the interbiblical period. The 100 years of freedom and the Maccabean reign. They had this group of people called the Maccabeans, who helped to get their freedom, and ultimately then the Romans came in, and that's where we are when the New Testament starts. Okay, all of that being said, when we talked about this, we talked about how a lot of stuff came about during the Babylonian captivity that shows us that the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were probably compiled. So there may have been small fragments, different places where someone might sit down and write something down and have it saved, but ultimately the complete coordination of those books didn't come till probably during the Babylonian Empire. Now, we've said that many times, and we've talked about how everything that was written in those books, especially in the book of Leviticus, was trying to tell people to not let go of their culture, not let go of their community. Okay, now, that's important. And I think what I'm about to tell you, is actually something that's also very important. And it's going to literally blow some people's minds. It's going to cause people to question everything they've ever known. And I mean that literally. I don't say that facetiously at all. So Yahweh, who we find in the Old Testament, Yahweh is talking to Moses. Yahweh talks multiple times. Actually, before we talk about Yahweh, let's shift back. Okay, so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form, darkness was upon the face of the deep, and all that. When we read that passage, there is a word used for God. It's not Yahweh. Yahweh, as a word, did not come into the Bible in its true form until God met with Moses. Okay? Prior to that, God was referred to as El by the people, in culture-wise. That's how they believed. El is not who you think it is, okay? El, and we get the word Elohim, basically means multiple L's or plural L's. Now, not saying there's plural gods, but plural, it's the plural word. And a lot of people say, oh, well, it's because of royalty, Godhead. Some people try to play that off as saying, oh, well, see, God is Trinity because Elohim is plural. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with it. At the time, the people actually used the plural version of the noun to talk about majesty. And so El was Elohim, which is the plural version of El. Okay, the Jews use this word El. El wasn't a Jewish god. El was a pagan Canaanite god. Okay, so El was not the Jewish god. In the beginning, anyway. He was the Canaanite god. El had a goddess named Asherah. And if you've been around Christianity and Christian scholarship for very long, you have heard of Asherah. Asherah is the goddess, the mother goddess. They had a son named Baal. Some people call it Baal, but Baal. And Baal was a storm deity. And Baal had a sister. I cannot remember the sister's name, and that part doesn't matter. Because El and Baal are the two that we've heard of. And some of us have heard of Asherah. These are Canaanite deities. El is God supreme in the Canaanite deity. Baal is the storm god. Okay. and we've heard about Bel. Bel is talked about multiple times. Now, people have tried to say that the Jews as a culture never had Baal as a major deity. But when we look through archaeological studies and look at some of the writings and things that were found, especially in the area that was once Babylon, you find that the Jews, first of all, the Hebrew language is actually a Canaanite language. The Hebrew language did not originate with the Hebrews. So, when Abraham came around and he became the father of the Hebrews, he did not bring with him this language. This language developed out of the people that lived in Canaan. So the language of the Hebrew people, was a Canaanite language. So the name El in the Hebrew language was the Canaanite word for the Canaanite supreme god El. And it has been discovered that the Jews were not monotheistic. Now, they had a primary deity, and we'll talk more about Yahweh in just a moment, but they weren't monotheistic. They believed that there were other deities. Old Hebrew, old Jews. They believed that there were other deities. They were polytheistic, but they focused their energy on this one God named Yahweh. Well, what's also been discovered is Yahweh was actually a regional deity that was a storm deity in the lower parts of Canaan. So Canaan, this whole big long country or area, it wasn't really its own country, but it had all these different people groups. They had the supreme god El, his wife Asherah, their son Baal, and then somewhere down here, other cultures had this concept of this other storm deity named Yahweh. Okay. We're not even going to get into Jehovah, okay? Jehovah is not a biblical word. Jehovah was actually a miscommunication of the Masoretes. Not going to talk about that. But what we are going to talk about is Yahweh. Yahweh was a Canaanite deity that was regional. He wasn't even the supreme deity, but he was the deity that was accepted by the Jews. And so we're talking about before Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were actually written, this all was developing. The Jews basically grabbed onto this deity Yahweh, and over time, they began to give Yahweh all of the different characteristics. And if you look through archaeological studies, you find out that there's proof of this. There's written examples of other countries that use Yahweh, these smaller regional areas that use the deity Yahweh, Yahweh of this country, Yahweh of this country. Or not really countries, but groups of people. So Yahweh ultimately was the deity, the main deity of the Jews. Well, as time went on, the Jews began to develop this cultural separation, which we talked about this when we talked about Genesis and Leviticus. Okay? So Yahweh, they began to build this cultural separation. So by the time of the Babylonian Empire, they had developed this cultural separation. Now, this had been developing throughout the time of before David, when we read in the Judges, where it talks about Baal and Yahweh, when we read about David, and the people are trying to turn away, push away from these other deities to focus strictly on Yahweh. Well, then, by the time we get to the Babylonian Empire, Yahweh is the primary deity, and if you look at Yahweh's characteristics, you'll notice that his characteristics, basically, the idea of Yahweh absorbed the characteristics of El, which was the Canaanite supreme deity, Asherah, the goddess mother, Baal, and Baal's sister, which, like I said, I don't remember her name, but she's a warrior. And so all of these characteristics were given by the Jews to Yahweh. And at this point, that's when they became like we think of monotheistic. So the reason why Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy were all written during the Babylonian Empire and why they were so focused on cultural separation was because they didn't get written way back here in the beginning. They got written way down here after the people had already began to focus all of their energy on Yahweh. And so when we say that the reason why Leviticus says that talks against sexual exploitation and the sex of older rich man with young children is because they're saying separate yourselves from the rest of Canaan. But Christians have taken this to say, oh, well, that all came way back here, and so they have felt that way this whole time. Well, no, they didn't have a single deity. It was a polytheistic culture until finally, maybe in the time of the Judges, things started to come together and they started to focus on Yahweh, but they still acknowledged these other deities. But for the sake of the people of Israel, they if all these other cultures wanted to serve all these other deities like Baal and Asherah and anybody else, they could do that. But the Jews, for them, they began focusing on Yahweh, and so then ultimately that's where Yahweh really comes out in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. Okay. All of that I say because I think it's important for us to realize that there's logical reasons why this happened this way. Now, apparently I have a mustache here. It's like poking my nose. It's driving me crazy. Fast forward. We get to the New Testament. What is the New Testament? The New Testament, again, is trying to focus the Jews away from the culture of now the Romans. And so we found that in the book of Corinthians. It was mentioned again in the book of Romans, where Paul is telling them to separate and to don't live like this other culture. Well, when we get to Timothy, that we're going to see that more, or we're going to see it a little bit. It's not as prominent in Timothy. But I wanted to bring all that out because I feel like that's a very important thing. That's something important for us to acknowledge and recognize. Okay, so we're here finally at the final Clobber passage. We are at the Clobber passage that we find in the book of Timothy. And the book of Timothy is, and we're going to, just like we've always done, we're going to begin by looking at context and biblical context as well as cultural context and the writer and the receiver. Now, the one thing you'll notice, and I really want to bring this out, most of this sounds like repetitive information. And it's because it is. Because the problems they were fighting against about sexual exploitation and prostitution of people, basically trafficking people, all of that existed all the way back from Canaan, all the way through the time of the Romans. So when the Hebrew or the Christian writers were writing, they were writing to a group of people that were still dealing with a lot of the same problems, saying, separate yourself from this exploitative type culture. But 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10 is actually kind of the footnote of all of this. And what's interesting is because it is the very last Clobber passage, a lot of times people will give it more weight. Because what they'll say is something along the lines of, well, okay, I can see where all of these other times they weren't really talking about the LGBTQ community. They were talking about exploitation, but what about this one? Just because it's the final one. But Really, it's the exact same reason. So that's why our focus, each of these lessons, has actually been to um, focus on more than just that, because I don't want to literally sit here every time and say the same thing over and over. Now I'll mention it, but Okay, so when we read this, we're going to kind of slow down and take a look at what this means in light of the people of the time. That's the one thing you've always got to remember about the Bible. You've always got to remember this about any passage we get from the Bible. If you remove it from its culture and context, you lose its meaning. A lot of times people say, "Oh, well, the Bible actually speaks about everything that we deal with today." Because what does Solomon say? There's nothing new under the sun. That's bull. Bull. I mean, like, bull. It is. The Bible does not deal with the vast majority of things that we deal with today. Okay? By the way, just to mention, the Jews actually, part of the Canaanite tradition where the Jews originated, part of it had child sacrifice. Just so you know. Okay? Now, needless to say, without focusing on that, though, that's not where I'm wanting to focus. If you take something out of its context, out of its cultural context, and out of its biblical context, you lose its real meaning. And when people try to say that the Bible deals with everything, it doesn't. The Bible doesn't deal with the majority of things that we deal with today. Now, there are passages and things that we can relate to what we're going through. But not once did the Bible say anything about global warming. That's actually why there's a lot of nationalists that say, "Oh, there's no such thing as global warming." Well, because the Bible doesn't talk about it. Well, actually, there are things that we can relate to that, being good stewards of what God has given us, taking dominion over the world. Those are all things that relate to, and we can relate to in Christianity as being good stewards of what God has given us here. Global warming, taking care of the environment, but the Bible does not directly hit that topic. Okay? So, when we get to the book of Timothy, we see very quickly that this passage is talking about exploitation, which is the same stuff we've been talking about, violence, abuse, harmful behaviors, destroying community. Again, we've been talking about it. Not once does it say anything about identities, sexual or gender or otherwise, and relationships, straight, gay, whatever. Nor does it talk about love. So, the first thing we have to do is we have to kind of deal with this authorship of Timothy. So, we want to better understand Timothy. Well, it's important for us to kind of see where Timothy came from, where the book came from, not the person. We'll talk about the person in a minute. But where the book came from. Well, there was a guy by the name of Paul. Most people attribute Paul, the apostle, as the author for the book of Timothy. But modern scholarship actually sees things a little bit differently. Most modern scholars believe that 1 Timothy, which is part of the pastoral epistles of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, the three, basically it's an epistle of an apostle or head pastor writing a pastoral letter to someone, Timothy or Titus, depending on which book you're talking about. But it is believed that it was written probably about 20 years, 15 to 20 years, 20 to 25 years after Paul's death. Closer to 20. Okay, and so there's several reasons for this. Now, before I say that, now, the person who wrote the book probably did have some type of connection with the real Paul. And I'll explain why. During this day and time, it was very normal for a follower of a person. Now, today's society, if I were to write a book and say that I was Abraham Lincoln, No, I mean that's the pen name I use, and people think, oh, wow, I didn't know Abraham Lincoln wrote this book. Well, I would be doing that to try to give myself clout, to try to give myself authoritativeness, right? Authority. And so I would be pretending to be Abraham Lincoln. Well, that's not how the people thought in the day when books like this were written. Instead, they would write using this pseudonym, this pen name, not as a forgery or a deception, but as a way to honor the teacher who they use the name of. So most likely, this was a disciple of Paul that knew Paul's ministry, that knew what Paul believed, who was writing in the name of Paul as a way to give honor to Paul, and so that he wasn't taking credit for something that was not his original work. Could have even been a her, for that matter. But the person was not wanting to infringe or to plagiarize Paul. They were instead wanting to give Paul credit for what they were writing, because they wanted to show honor to Paul. This was very normal, a very normal practice in the ancient world. Again, it was not a forgery or a deception. It was a way to honor the voice and continued work of someone who had already passed away. And it's possible that this person was a direct student of Paul, but, Now, all of that being said, these are some reasons why people believe that Paul probably didn't write this book. First, the vocabulary in the pastoral epistles. Now, when I say pastoral epistles, I'm talking 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, all three. There are 300 Greek words that appear in those three books that were never used by Paul in any of his verified, or not verified, but confident believed writings. Next, the writing style, such as the rhythm, the structure, the way things are brought out, the rhetorical patterns, they differ from those things of the undisputed letters. Now, the undisputed letters are basically letters like Galatians and Romans, things that we don't dispute. Oh, did Paul really write this or not? Most likely, Paul did write those two books. At least that's the general consensus. So when we get to Timothy and Titus, and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written in such a language, a way of saying things, literary devices, that it is so different than the Pauline writings that we really truly believe came from Paul, that it's hard to believe that it's the same person writing. Next, Timothy, the books of 1st Timothy, 2nd Timothy, and Titus really doesn't deal with this, but 1st and 2nd Timothy describe a more developed church hierarchy, as in elders, overseers, and deal with things in the church itself that it did not develop until much later than Paul. See, during the time of Paul, there weren't these major elders and overseers. Now, there were deacons. We know that deacons came out earlier. But the actual elders and overseers that Paul talks about, that concept did not develop until years after Paul's death. Also, the theological emphasis in the pastoral epistles is completely different than in the undisputed books. In Galatians and Romans, you'll learn that Paul talks much about grace. It's all about grace. It's all about the return of Christ. It's all about love and mercy. When we get to Timothy, you find that it's not about grace. It's about false teachers and errored doctrine. Not an errant doctrine, but errored doctrine. And so it is believed, because of all of these differences, that most likely the book of 1 Timothy was not Paul writing. The pastoral epistles they actually were not accepted by the church for many years. The acceptance of the pastoral epistles were unevenly recepted, or they were had an uneven reception. Some Christian communities embraced them, said, "Oh yes, this is the word of God," and others said, "No, no, this isn't the word of God. There's no way this is the word of God." And isn't it Timothy that says that all word is inspired by God? Interesting. Anyway, that's not a topic for tonight. So others, some people, some groups embraced it. Some people said, "Nope, ain't it." They didn't embrace it, and it took many, many, many years and several councils for them to finally say, "Okay, let's leave it in there." Now, during that time when they were trying to find the canonical books, there were a lot of books that were questioned. Many people didn't want Revelation in there. Many people didn't want Jude in there. And the reason is, if you look at Jude and 2nd Peter, they're basically the same book. I mean, there's little differences, but most of it, it looks like someone took the book and wrote, "Oh, I like those ideas. Here, I'm going to write a letter now, and I'm going to use a lot of the same ideas." And then they, anyway, they're very similar. There were a lot of people that didn't believe that the pastoral epistles as a whole, the 3 books, were Paul's writings, or not even Paul, but that they were canonical, that they were books that should have ended up in the Bible. And there were a lot of books that were considered to be put in the Bible that weren't. Gospel of Philip, Gospel of, like, the Mary Magdalene Gospel. I mean, there's several things that at one time or another, some people looked at and said, "Hey, yeah, the Gospel." I think there's a Judas book, or maybe I'm just thinking of Jude. I'm probably just thinking of Jude. There's also the Book of Enoch, which is not a New Testament extra biblical work. It's an Old Testament, but interestingly, there's a lot of things in the Old Testament that actually came from the Book of Enoch. And what's interesting about that is the book isn't seen as canonical, but some of the canonical books include passages from the Book of Enoch, which actually, if we do another study next week from Jude, we'll be talking about the Book of Enoch, so come back for that. Okay, so concerns included things like the advanced hierarchy of the church. Again, some of the same things that we talked about a moment ago. The tone was such dramatically different. The use of letters to justify controversial practices. So here's another little off topic that I want to get for a moment. Here's another little side note. Apparently I'm on squirrels. I'm really on squirrels tonight. So, and the thing is, we're over halfway done, and I haven't even gotten to the verse yet. So anyway, interestingly enough, it's very common in the early church, and even to 2nd and 3rd, 4th century, for controversial things to be written in. So someone thought, "Oh, well, this is an area that I want to deal with XYZ. I don't like this certain thing happening, so I want to deal with it. So I'm going to write a letter and claim to be an authority in this." So there are sometimes they do that. Claim to be an authority in this so that I can rid the church of X, Y, and Z. And that happens. That happened a lot, actually. So, for instance, the Book of Mark, most people don't know it, but the Book of Mark actually ended at 16:8. And basically, 16:8 says that the women ran from the tomb and blah, 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 and that's it. It cut off. Well, by the 2nd century, the church, so we're looking at 30 years, because most likely it is believed that Paul probably died around 64 AD. That's the traditional viewpoint. And the book of the 3 pastoral epistles weren't actually written until like 85 to 100 AD. So there's a 20 to 25 year difference there. So talking about the Book of Mark ended, and people by the 2nd century, by the 100s, so about 40 years after Paul, they're questioning this. They're like, well, why do we end it right there? There's no resurrection mention. There's no this. There's no that. There's no Great Commission. There's nothing. It just cuts off. So people began writing endings to this book, and again, I'm trying to show how things were used to justify changes, but actually it was fake stuff that was being used. So it ended at verse 8. They had people that complained about this, so scribes started writing answers or endings. And there was several different endings, but one was this long ending, which includes 9 through whatever. I don't remember what the last verse of Mark is. I think it's 16 or 17. So 9 through that. And then there was one that was just like this really kind of more in-depth thing that was completely off, and people didn't like that one very much. So ultimately, the church came back and said, wait a second, we can't just add text like that. We can't just do that. And all of a sudden, when they start complaining about it and they're saying, no, we're not going to accept this extra amended part to the book of Mark, we're just not going to accept it because it was not originally there, a scribe miraculously found an ancient manuscript that included that, even though it was made up by someone, and it just miraculously appeared. Yeah. So that was very common in the church with things that they wanted written in the Bible. That they would write it in and they would say, oh, look, I found this new manuscript that says this. And so now, because of that, we're going to add it to this book. And yes, that does happen. Sorry, Mom. It does. It's just the way it is. And the church would still do it today if we didn't have what we call a closed canon. Churches probably still do that. I mean, look at the Mormons. So, okay. Timothy. So who's Timothy? Timothy is one of the closest companions of Paul. He is like a spiritual son. The writer of the book of 1 Timothy actually referred to him as a son in Christ. Timothy is also of mixed background. So his mother's Jewish, his father's Greek. So he has clout. He has credibility in both the Jewish and Greek communities. He was a young, gentle, pastoral person. He was deeply trusted by Paul, and Paul even sent him to the church of Corinth and the church of Ephesus because Timothy knew how to handle conflict. And for this reason, there was a lot of conflict going on. There was false teaching, there was misusing of the laws, there was power struggles, confusion on doctrine, and then social instability, which we're going to talk about that in just a second. So the book was written to Timothy to try to help him overcome these issues. Now, as I said, the book of 1 Timothy was probably not written until 85 to 100 CE or after Christ, if you go AD. And then Paul's death actually occurred in 64 CE, so he was dead for about 20 years before this book was written. Okay. So the situation in Ephesus, and this is our last bit of context before we jump right into the text, and we're almost done because we only got like 15 minutes left. So Ephesus, the city of Ephesus actually was a major city in commerce in the world at that time, and they had this one specific thing that everybody knew it for, and it was a temple to Artemis. Now, Artemis, this temple to Artemis was so important that it was actually one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I did a study on Ephesus once for school, and I loved it. I love doing studies like that. But Ephesus had this temple, and what's interesting is they had a major difference in social economic culture. You had the really rich, and you had the really poor. And the really rich people, they were they were rich. They would exploit the poor people. They would use them for things. They would do things with them that were not right. They would force them into things that they were did not want to do. But because of their place in society, they were allowed to do this. So this is the type of stuff that was going on in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was also known for magic. It was also known for philosophy, and there were many competing religions. And when someone brought a new idea to the city of Ephesus, people would grab on it, much like we do in Christianity today. Someone brings this new idea, and oh, look, it's all the churches are doing this now. Well, that's what they did. They were very big on religious syncretism. Basically, they would, instead of throwing out their beliefs to accept a new belief, such as Christianity, they would just add Christianity into what they were already doing. So they would just grab bits and pieces that they like and shove it all together and create this big religious conglomerate, this hodgepodge of different things. So, okay, so the cultural context of this passage. In the passage, we're actually gonna be focusing on verse 10, but it's important for us to kind of understand how 1 Timothy is set up. And so 1 Timothy, the first two verses begin with I, Paul, blah, 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 of Jesus, and blah, 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 blah. And then verse 2 says, to Timothy, my son in Christ, blah, 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 and he does his normal little salutation. Then we get to verse 3, and it says, I urge you, as I did on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain people not to teach different teachings. Okay, so people were teaching things that Paul didn't want taught, or that whomever was writing this didn't want taught. Basically, they were changing up the doctrine. Not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculation rather than divine training that is known by faith. So people would claim to be this high, mighty authority in a certain area because they followed the tradition of this person, and that person followed the tradition of this person, and that person followed the tradition of this person. And so they would build these genealogies of different people that they would follow or say that they'd follow, and they would say, I should have authority to say what I want to because I follow this tradition that follows that tradition that follows that tradition, and go on back. It says, known by faith, so true divine training that is known by faith. But the aim of such instruction is love and comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. Some people have deviated from these and turned to meaningless talk, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they're saying or the things about which they are asserting. So basically, people were getting to the point that they were trying to teach law, like Jewish law, and they didn't understand, first of all, what they were saying, and they didn't understand what they meant. So meaning these people were trying to teach the law, but they didn't really know what the law said, or understand what the law said, and they didn't know what it meant, what the law meant. So moving on, verse 8. Now we know that the law is good, and if one uses it legitimately, this means understanding that the law is laid down not for the righteous, but for the lawless and disobedient. Now, remember that, because Paul, the real writer that is believed to have really been Paul, wrote to the Galatians talking about, why are you that have trusted in Jesus now letting the Judaizers come in and make you believe in these laws, because these are righteous people that he's talking to. And he said, why are you now trying to revert to the law? And right here it says that the law was not for the obedient, righteous people, but for the disobedient, for the godless and the sinful, for the unholy, the profane. Now here we go. For the ones who kill their father and mother, for murderers, that's number one, the sexual immoral, men who engage in illicit sex, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. Now, some passages have actually taken sexually immoral and illicit sex and focused it strictly on homosexuality. And then he goes on in verse 11 and says, that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I was entrusted. So sound doctrine that conforms to God. Okay. So the reason why this list of vices is given is because, especially in ancient writings, they would use this as a way to compare things, kind of like apples to apples. So they would say murderers and someone Christian wise that, someone who brings life. I don't know. They would use two different things and lay them beside each other, and they would give this list of vices, this list of problems to say, this is what's bad in comparison to the right gospel. So when seeing this, he's not giving them a legal code. He's telling them about things that are harmful to their community. This was stuff that was going on in the surrounding city that was harmful to the community of the church. Now, here's a word that we mentioned in the study from Corinthians. Arsenokoitai. Now, arsenokoitai is only found in a couple of places. It's one of these words that they believe Paul coined. People have tried to say that it represents homosexuals. But in actuality, the word itself, because of the roots that build this word, it is believed to be one who exploits. And the way they figure this out is they have looked at similar words, such as arsenokoitai, words similar to that, in extra-biblical writing, cultural context, and later usage. And from that, the consistent theme of this word is exploitation. Now, it can be used to talk about sexual exploiting sex with children, sex with youth, sex with women, men, whoever. It could mean abuse of power. It could mean coercion, economic exploitation, any of those things. The word itself has nothing to do with a loving, mutual consent relationship between two men or two women, or someone who doesn't really have a gender. Which, as we said a few weeks ago, they had that idea of the genderless, even in the Jewish world. The word doesn't point to anything mutual, any type of loving relationship. It is not translated as homosexuals. But in the 1900s, in 1946, the RSV did put the word homosexuals in that place. However, the word itself, culturally, refers to exploitation. Then we have malakoi. Malakoi means soft, and so malakoi is used for a moral weakness, an indulgence in things that they know they should stay away from, a laziness, a corruption, a lack of discipline. Nowhere in it does it describe homosexual orientation. But because it does have this softness to it, some people went and tried to say, oh, well, that's talking about the receiving end of a sexual relationship, a homosexual relationship. And then some people come back and say, oh, well, then that means arsenokoitai must mean the active end. So the person who's... but the words, when you look where they came from, it doesn't line up. So what is the actual purpose of what the writer is doing? The writer is warning Timothy about people who misuse the law. The law is meant for restraint. Now, we're not talking about the we're not talking about the Roman law. We're talking about the Jewish law. Law is meant for restraint, to restrain from harming behavior. By the way, you notice I didn't switch slides. Yeah, I spend all this time getting the slides together and never use them. Um, so they list things like murderers, slave traders, liars, perjurers, violent people, exploiters. Nowhere in that list does it really truly say anything about the LGBTQ. Wow, I am struggling tonight. Nowhere in it does it talk about loving relationships or include any type of conventional partnership. So, by misusing this passage has been used to drive people out of the church. It's been used to cause shame in many people's lives, and I have lived it. It has been used to cause fear, causing people to not want to be who they are. It has been used to silence people's voices and the truth, and it has distorted the gospel. So, as we wrap up this final passage in the Clobber passages, we find basically that every single one of these passages has to do with one thing. They have to do with exploitation, usually of rich, wealthy people exploiting people below them. Sometimes it had to do with the adults exploiting the teenage boys. Stuff like that. That every single one of these passages that we've looked at has talked about exploitation. Nowhere in it does it talk about loving mutual relationships. Nowhere in it does it talk about a consensual relationship between two men or two women. Instead, it talks about and leads to an abuse of power, exploitation, harm to individuals that are a different social bracket. All of these behaviors basically destroy the community. And that's why the writer of this book was saying all of these things are destroying the community in Ephesus. So work to not allow these things to destroy. So that's our final verse in the Clobber passages. Keep watching because we may go ahead and look at the book of Jude next week and look at where it overlaps with the book of Enoch. I don't know. I'll have to see if they want to go ahead and do that one or not. So anyway, God bless. Y'all have a great evening, and I hope you learned something. So long.